Okay, hey everybody, Jerry McHugh Jr. here. Semon Resources. I'm an owner, president, independent exploration company, and this is our view, our lens of the Energy IQ as independents. Today, we are privileged to have Tom Petrie, a good friend, colleague, exciting and super knowledgeable energy expert, oil and gas, on today's IQ. So if you're an American and you use energy, then today's podcast is right for you. Tom's had a stellar 52-year career. Talk about your perspective, Tom, what you've done to see things as you do these days and across your career. And welcome.
Thanks, Jerry. It's a pleasure to be here and do this again. We did one about a year ago, as I recall. And a lot's happened since then that we can get into on this. My career began when I graduated from West Point. So I was serving in the Army at that point. I went to Ranger School and then to Germany. I was in Germany for just about 2 years. I was there during the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia in '69. And one morning, 4:30 or so, the phone rang and said, "We're going to the field and it's not an exercise." And within 8 hours, we were out on the Czech border. Russian liaison officers who were supposed to make sure we didn't have an accidental war start were monitoring us, following us, and monitoring our frequencies and routes of deployment and so on. Back when I graduated from West Point in '67, that was literally the day after the Six-Day War began in the Middle East. And as I mentioned in Following Oil, which I published back in 2014, was the first. It could have been the first oil crisis. As it turned out, it wasn't, because the world still had plenty of energy and plenty of shut-in production in the hands of OPEC. And OPEC really, at that time, really wanted to continue to supply the market and have it not disturbed by things like Israel invading some of the territory of Egypt and all that. But ever since then, every time we've had military conflicts, we've tended to have real disruptions in energy. I've got a chart that we've used in the past that basically shows 14 different major inflection points, or 14 different inflection points, all caused by geopolitical events around the world, mostly in the Middle East, certainly in the Eastern Hemisphere. After I came home from Vietnam and completed my obligations in the Army, I was an advisor there in Vietnam. When I came home, I got out. I had actually completed the coursework for an MBA while I was in Germany with Boston University. And I was hired to be an oil analyst in Boston with a company that managed the endowment funds of MIT and Dartmouth and some mutual funds. And I did that for a couple of years, and then was hired in New York by a sell-side research firm known as H.C. Wainwright. I worked with them for about 7 years and became a partner 5 years in, and then joined First Boston. And First Boston Corporation hired me as a senior oil analyst. At that point, I'd been through the Yom Kippur War and the impact of that on a lot of things. That whole decade of the 70s was pretty interesting. And it was one that was characterized by, in chapter 2 of my book, I talk about it. I say it was a tumultuous decade. We were experimenting with deeply flawed price regulation and other adverse regulations on energy. And that we learned one critical lesson from the 70s was the law of unintended consequences is always alive and well. So whenever you make big policy decisions, and our government was forced to do that twice during that decade. First was the Yom Kippur War, and the second time was the situation involving the Iranian Revolution. And those two, each of those events caused a tripling of oil prices. In 73, 74, $3 oil moved up to $9 and ultimately $11 oil. It drifted up after that over the next half decade. And in 1978, 79, we had the Iranian Revolution. So $13 oil became $39 oil. And all of that had real adverse effects, obviously, on consuming countries, including the US. I then moved from working for First Boston in New York to opening an office for First Boston in Denver, Colorado. And I've been based in Denver ever since, 42 years. It's hard to believe it, but I am in that 52nd year now in business after I left the Army. And I've been through quite a few cycles and so on. And some of what we'll talk about today gives me a chance to talk about some of the parallel events that we're going through today that really are reminiscent, and I would say eerily reminiscent of what we lived through in the 70s. We've got high inflation. We've got a government that's elevated climate priorities over energy security priorities. We've got a Congress where the appreciation of the challenges of having secure energy is pretty shallow, the shallow appreciation, and we can get into that as well. So when I think about it, I'm really struck by it. And I was given a talk recently in Pittsburgh, and I was looking for the right word for it. And I was thinking of the word redux, the 1970s redux. And so I went to the dictionary to find that word. Of course, that's kind of a colloquialism, but the closest word they came up with was reduplicated. And when they defined reduplicated, they say double. And that's kind of what we're going through. It's almost as if some of the lessons learned 40 years ago, the better part of a half century, are not being institutionalized in the memory of policymakers. And so some of the things such as President Biden scolding the energy industry on high gasoline prices, when in fact, the willingness to acknowledge that the first action of this administration that kicked off what is now on the verge of becoming superinflation, or at least very problematic inflation, started on his first day in office. Oil was $48 a barrel that day. And when he canceled the XL pipeline and declared a pause on drilling on federal lands, those two events were a real signal out there to the market. 3 weeks later, 21 days later to the day, oil was $60 a barrel and has not traded below that level since then. So that's a 25% boost in energy inflation kicked off as part of the first two policy actions of this administration. Has he admitted it? Has he admitted that kicked it off, and that inflation psychosis, if you will, or psychology became embedded because of other things that have happened since? No, he's really blaming it all on Mr. Putin. I would agree that Mr. Putin's invasion of the Ukraine has exacerbated an already bad situation. But much of the progress toward that bad situation started on day one of this particular administration.
Well, you had said we've spoken last couple months, and you got a presentation we shared. You talked about that we're in the midst of the most challenging times since World War II. So, can you talk about what you mean by that, not just from an energy perspective, but geopolitically and obviously?
Sure.
Russia.
Sure. I really believe that's the case. We had trying times in the 70s, even every decade has been challenging. But the reason I think the current one is more challenging, there's several reasons. One, the geopolitical makeup post 9/11, after the destruction of the World Trade Center, something changed in the Eastern Hemisphere. Shortly thereafter, we ended up with the Gulf War, and that was an overcommitment, and some would say a questionable judgment about the U.S. going after weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and then failing to find them. In any case, as time evolved, we began to see tighter relationships between some of the Eastern Hemisphere players. China and Russia in particular had an axis of cooperation. The old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, applied. And so they realized that a combination or a coordination of their powers between Moscow and Beijing might be useful. And I put a map in my book about that. And I talked about overlapping power triangles that were evolving. And over time, they've been rigidifying. So that now there's an axis of coordination, if you will, between China and Russia, between Russia and Iran, and between Iran and China. And then there's another set of triangles that have evolved, not as strong as the one I just described, but almost as a consequence of that, relationships between Russia and India and Iran, and China comes in on that one as well. So you end up with these overlapping power triangles that are really going to be a challenge. And if you don't think those exist, just take a look at what Putin has said recently when he talked about whether the US was really cognizant of how the relationships involving those overlapping power triangles are evolving. He didn't use those words, but he was talking about the evolving relationships between those three countries as they coordinate what they want to do geopolitically. And the reason that this is concerning relative to the threat of World War II is that while the conflagration of World War II was much broader, so far the relationship here is more contained, but it does involve weaponry that is nuclear. And therefore the threat of nuclear engagement is out there both in rogue states, Korea being an example. Certainly Pakistan has the weapon now, and the fear of further spread of weaponry is very real, and the threat of it is not one to be easily dismissed. So you've got both the geopolitical realignment in the Eastern Hemisphere along with nuclear weaponry. Now, the old playbook would say you go back to mutually assured destruction. And that certainly was the way we got through the Cold War of the 1970s and 80s. But this time around, the consequences of actually having mutually assured destruction could be so much greater that it gives you pause. And the issue that we now have as well with what we learned about and have not learned about as well, pandemics. We've yet to have a really good accounting of the source of the pandemic that has become an endemic, and where we'll be dealing with it the rest of my life, I suspect. You put all of that together in a contentious world anyway, and now an inflationary world, I rest my case that we have to think of this as every bit as challenging as anything we saw in the 1970s or 80s during the last Cold War confrontation.
So you also talked about how the US's bungling of the Afghan withdrawal had significant, and we've talked about this several times, and you keep bringing it up, what a big deal it was. And obviously MAD is a great theory to have if we have equal numbers of missiles pointing at each other. But I look at the Russian deliberate targeting of civilians, is, I mean, what's to say that this isn't going to just go on and other countries are going to do this to us, perhaps?
Resolve is going to be a big question here. Will there be the resolve to deal with this the way it needs to be dealt with? Already we see the Western Alliance, which certainly was much stronger in reacting than President Putin expected. And I, by the way, do believe that President Putin's comment to Chairman Xi that this would be over in 3 days was driven by his judgment about the ineptitude of the U.S. withdrawal, the execution on the withdrawal. Was there a need to bring that to a conclusion? I wouldn't quarrel with that as a priority, but I would say the way it was executed was horrendously poorly executed. And that, I think, contributed to what many would judge to be the recklessness of Russia's attack on the Ukraine. And sure enough, we were almost on the verge of something rather different as an outcome when several Western European countries and the US all offered Mr. Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, a place of asylum. And he quickly dismissed it with his statement, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. And that's been his line ever since. And the bravery and the confrontation has been a big surprise, I think, to the Russians. But he's still not confused that he does not want to give an inch of land. And it's going to be darn hard for that coalition to support him on the basis of this and pull it off in my mind. I think how he gets dislodged from land he's taken, where he has achieved, if he can keep it, the land bridge he needed to tie Crimea, which he took in 2014 without the kind of reaction that we had this time. So that's one more element in the picture. Yes, the crimes against humanity, the summary executions of people, and so on are all there. But now what we're seeing is the Germans went through quite a change in mindset, and they really have just announced in the last 2 days that because they're now being squeezed by reduced gas from Russia, they're going to be restarting some of their coal plants. So you don't restart coal plants to do it for a few weeks. You're doing that knowing you're going to need that coal energy for a matter of years before you get the alternative of LNG imports from other parts of the world. So the legacy of Angela Merkel in accommodating the Nord Stream pipeline and the increased dependence as they dismantled their nuclear facilities. Clean energy is nuclear. The cleanest energy is nuclear in many respects. And certainly coal is not clean energy, but it's necessary energy if you don't want to be overly dependent on Russia. So there's a set of challenges coming that we're going to have to work through, and we haven't heard much from this administration in the U.S. about what has happened in the last 2 days when they begin to realize that Russia plans to demonstrate where do you think you're going to go for your LNG in the near term. And that got compounded, and it's very unfortunate that it happened, but the fire that took Freeport LNG off being able to export U.S. natural gas to Europe and to the global markets for that matter. It's really had a global impact. is very sobering to see. And then initially they thought, well, they'll be back on in maybe a week or 10 days. And now it's pretty clear. Let's hope they're back on before the end of the fourth quarter. So that's a big reality test, if you will, for the German strategy that countered on the notion Russia needs to sell this to get good hard currency. We need it in order to proceed with our climate sensitive plans. And at the moment, the climate sensitive plans are certainly in jeopardy. And as far as Putin's concerned, the price adjustments in energy leave him relatively unaffected, or at least less affected than many thought he would be when they were talking about rejecting Nord Stream gas. He's the one who decided to take Nord Stream gas to half the level, less than half the level. I think they're running at 40% right now. And that's his advanced course teaching on second order effects when you don't like his invasion of Ukraine.
Well, and I'd heard some numbers that even with the drop in Russian oil production, their netbacks on a per day basis was relatively unchanged on oil sales, only because the price had gone up so much. And so that's obviously another second order of consequence. And the Western leaders, including the United States and Europe, all had these, hopeful commercial deals with Russia we're going to all be in peace and love, and the world's just going to be great from here on. So we really had a challenge with national leaders across the West.
Yep.
And some of these policies that you've talked about, second order consequences. Any more comments on that you would say?
Well, I've said that the XL pipeline was obviously a decision that took apparently no account of that. As I understand it, the day before he canceled that pipeline, Canadian company senior executives came to Washington to assure him that they would work cooperatively with the U.S. on climate objectives, but that this was really important as a strategic alliance between Canada and the U.S. Canada's arguably as important to us as any of the European nations in dealing with the challenges that we're going to have, not just this year, but for the next several decades with China. And for him to reject that basis, that economic cooperative basis that the pipeline represented, was really short-sighted. So I think that's it. And then when he later on that day decided to declare a pause on federal permits and for drilling and fracking on federal lands, that was another mistake, because what you have, it's now a year and a half later, and a year and a half later, that pause is not a pause, it's a permanent pause. A permanent pause sort of sounds to me like an oxymoron. And I would say for that permanent pause to continue from here is really kind of a very poor policy. And I might even be tempted to call it a moronic policy. We'll find out whether the reality seeps into this administration on that one.
I see in our business, and of course, I've spent some time, spending obviously this webinar, and I've gotten a lot of knowledge and information from you and the Power Hungry podcast, the blogs that are out. Some of these good things that are out there are really good. A lot of leaders in the oil and gas industry, which are trying to get the facts out. And, energy security is such a major thing, but apparently nationally, we're going totally the different way from energy security. and where is that going to leave us from our where we can be? I mean, incrementally, it's not bad right now, but it can get bad if we're going to rely on Venezuela and Saudi Arabia and Iran for our crude supplies versus our own domestic. And from a climate change perspective, that's not any good either.
No, you're right. You know, we've got leadership in the industry today that by and large consists of survivors and thrivers from the shale revolution. And the shale revolution grew pretty directly out of the industry learning how to deal with bad policy, short-term policy, shallow appreciation of some of the things that were done. We did it in the natural gas area where contracts, take or pay contracts were just torn up and thrown away. And then we had to reconstitute the nature of how natural gas could be distributed. And we went through a nightmare, and I talk about it in Following Oil, a nightmare of changes that had to be done to create interconnections of our pipeline network. When we did that, we began to realize we had, with the resource that was behind that, we had a much better ability to supply not only our needs for growing natural gas, where the chemistry of gas with a lower carbon content in that kind of fossil fuel would enable us to, in the aftermath of the Kyoto Accord, which we did not sign in 1997, we were able to actually achieve much better compliance with the goals of the Kyoto Accord of getting back to CO2 emissions that were 1992 levels. And that was big. So we've got a real challenge ahead. The climate envoy, John Kerry, has kept a low profile. I think there's a recognition out there that in among the supporters of the Democratic Party that he's a lightning rod. And so he's basically working largely behind the scenes. He gave a few interviews early on. He's really made sure he didn't give many more recently, because as the adverse consequences of some of the president's early actions have become clear, they don't want him having to get seriously cross-examined on what else is afoot. And now we start to see lip service paid to some things about how we deal with the challenge that's come up with the Ukrainian crisis and how that represents an energy challenge to Western Europe first and to the US ultimately. And we're going to have to deal with the changing set of circumstances. The amount of leverage we have is not infinite. And basically, one of the things we need to recognize is we've had a long-term relationship, for example, with Saudi Arabia. So the Saudis developed a pretty sophisticated way of making sure that they didn't overreach as the leader of OPEC in upward adjustments in prices. Sometimes they did occur because of events the Saudis couldn't control. Certain geopolitical events, including things like the Ukrainian crisis, have contributed to prices going ever higher. But it's not a case of OPEC automatically wanting to make that happen. A lot's happening right now. Realism in energy is really needed. Robert Bryce, who you're going to have on, is very articulate on this subject. And he's made some points in a recent presentation to the Senate. And I'll let you get that from him when he's on. But I will tell you that I met with him personally afterward, and his feeling seemed to be, I read his feeling was he felt like he was talking maybe to a wall, that the appreciation of what he was talking about was somewhat shallow. They knew they needed to listen to him, but there was a lot of resistance to embracing what he thought would be realism in energy. So I've got a lot of time for him. His book, Juice, speaks to electricity. Other books he's done in the past on various matters when he was at the Manhattan Institute, a very credible think tank, are really worth understanding because he goes in depth to what's involved. And that's an important element in this whole leadership issue. One of the big issues we have is that there's been a de facto elevation by this administration of climate change priorities above all other threats. They're so concerned about the existential threat to humanity from climate change that the nearer term threat of reduced energy security that came out of the shale revolution, they're more than willing to forfeit that. And the reality has to be that if you forfeit that, your ability to ever ultimately deal with the existential threat that's, they believe, lies out there in 2050 or beyond, you don't get to survive as an effective society and nation or collection of nations if you're not recognizing that. And that's a big one. So I think we have to be cognizant the climate change objectives above energy security objectives and look to reduce carbon content of our energy in ways that are practical, feasible, and not destructive to energy security in the near and intermediate term. I would say the near and intermediate term is anywhere from a half decade from now to two and a half decades from now. And navigating that period of time, some of which is still within my lifespan, I hope, is going to be critical. And if we do it well and with wisdom, and we learn how to deal with the challenge of intermittency, then I'm optimistic that we'll come out of this better than we might first conclude today.
Well, energy security, in my thinking, is such a novel idea for it's like a defense tool. It's an essential tool to have defend our country. With strong security, you keep your prices down. You're not dependent on rogue regimes. You know, you and I know what it was like in the 70s when all heck broke loose because we were so dependent on other places for our energy.
Exactly.
And I mean, what a tool! It's been a great tool for the last dozen or so years. My fear is we're slipping on this energy security.
You're exactly right. And, you know, when Jennifer Granholm, the Secretary of Energy, was speaking before Congress recently, one of the questions put to her was, do you follow what's happened to U.S. production of oil? And, you know, do you realize where it is and where it may be going? And she was kind of proud in proclaiming her ignorance of that. It was really striking because, you know, the facts are it was north of 13 million barrels a day when he came into office. And we dropped, and certainly I can't blame him totally on COVID. COVID caused it to drop for a variety of reasons to something under 10, challenging 10 million barrels a day. So that would be down by 3 million barrels a day. We've had a recovery that gets us back to the low 11 million barrels a day level. But the likelihood that embedded declines will take it lower yet unless there's some change in policy toward domestic development of fossil fuels. And the consequence of that is one that's going to be threatening to economic growth and trade balances and overall market stability in North America.
Well, and while we're seeing a run up in crude and we're seeing a run up in natural gas, unprecedented this time of year, I might add. I mean, as an energy producer and independent, of course, you love high prices. but you want them to be sustainable so that we don't have the ultra lows that a recession can bring. I think if you talk to 90% of the producing companies and producers or small independents, they want reasonable pricing. We don't want natural gas at $65 like they sell in Germany when it was tight. We want $6.50. If we could have that consistently, that would be wonderful. Especially for little guys like us, it's something we can depend on, and those sorts of things. So the independence and the energy producer perspective, to me is really it needs to be out there, and you can accentuate that because you've worked with so many producers on that.
Yeah, no, you're right. That's one of the challenges. But instead of that, we're actually looking at this period as more like the 70s than I would have ever thought even 2 years ago. We're hearing talks about, well, we need revenue at the government level, so let's come up with a windfall profits tax because we're way beyond what most people would consider a reasonable price. And the windfall profits tax, they just want to divert that overage into other spending programs that are arguable as to their efficacy. We've got the president scolding oil executives on gas prices. We've got low or no analysis, second order consequences still on bad policy decisions. And so all of those things need to really be thought out. And I think that makes the upcoming midterm election one of the most important in my adult life, where there's some reason to believe that at least one house and maybe both houses will switch to Republican control. And we'll have to hope that there's wisdom on the Republican side too. There have been times when one had to wonder about that, but I can't believe they'll be as inattentive to those second order consequences as we've been seeing here in the last year and a half.
We talked about overlooked basins in the United States. We saw a really good presentation on DJR of the San Juan Basin about a week ago. One of your themes is with independents and small companies is where are we advantaged? Where are we advantaged in these overlooked basins? Talk a little bit about that, and we'll.
Yeah, I think there's two things going on. One, there are lots of people who have in their own minds, through their careers, a place they want to go back to because of the learnings that they've adapted. And so when you look at Dave Lehman's company, DJR, what he learned while he was at Exxon, he kept that in mind, what those learnings were, and he used some of the same criterion that had been used at Exxon, a super major. He used it as a creative and innovative CEO of a relatively small independent, and he did it in a way where he traded first into the DJ Basin, and a couple of transactions that he monetized at good gains. He gave him the wherewithal then to go to an overlooked basin in the San Juan with a specific view of this is an area where the people have always known about the gas in the San Juan, but the ability to start thinking about what you could do with horizontal drilling and fracking and development of some of the liquids potential. And some others had already pioneered some of that. Rick Moncrief's company had done some of that, and he went in and developed it. So what I think is the essence of this is that some of these independent companies are always thinking about where else to go and figure out how to apply the tools, the advancing tools of technology. When you go back 30 years, we didn't know we could drill mile long and mile and a half long, and in some cases 2 mile long laterals, stay in zone, frack the reservoir, and have highly economic returns at prices that are well below where they are today. Those kind of advances are there. The Forest City Basin could be a resource play. There's a private independent that is thinking that way and has made the case. The San Juan Basin fits in that. Various aspects of the Permian Basin. You know, we say, oh, the Permian Basin's been around since it was opened up in 1926 with a Ranger field, and then the Yates field a few years later came on, and then we saw the other successes across Texas. But think vertically as well as horizontally on the map, and lo and behold, there are basins with multiple layers where there's zones that people said, oh, I can't get to that. I'm dealing with $50 oil, or I'm dealing with times 30 or $40 oil. And then they say, you know, now that we've got oil or gas at different levels, how about those other zones we didn't bother with back 2, 3, or 4 decades ago? So there's that kind of innovation going on. The second thing that's going on is new techniques. There's a new technique involving today making LNG on a small scale basis. You know, we were very much involved at Petrie Parkman in funding the first of Cheniere Energy's big success as a world scale developer of LNG because of the transformation of large gas. But when you look at our system, there's something that's coming out of one of the South American countries where they had gas supplies and they needed to get it to the relevant market in that country. And so they started saying, well, let's see if we can build a small scale modularized LNG. There is now a successful enterprise thinking about how do we do modularized LNG, and we can build these in a matter of a series of months, not a series of years, and not billions of dollars, but aggregate over time, 100 million, 150 million, but getting to a level where it's an economic proposition. So that's a good example of an innovation. There are all kinds of other innovations going on right now that continue to surprise me, because each and every one of them, people don't realize energy companies are really high technology companies. And even the availability of some of those techniques for the private independent, the small independent, is increasing. So I think there are going to be market responses. I find myself perversely more optimistic than I would think to be as I start looking at some of those examples. And I think modularized LNG in parts of Appalachia. Right now, what's the problem in Appalachia? Cove Point is our only world-class export facility. And there's all kinds of reasons why permitting and building another Cove Point, given the population density of gas on the East Coast, it's a big challenge. I'm not saying it won't ever happen, but it's not easily achieved. On the other hand, if you can do modularized LNG and get it then to consumers in the domestic market, you can really have an economic proposition, because the truckers that want to use LNG are going to be pricing against diesel made out of higher priced oil.
Well, really appreciate your thoughts on that. I know we had a little pipeline producing basin takeaway segment to talk about, but that could be an answer for modular LNG to move gas out of. I mean, San Juan has up to 4 BCF a day, which can go to California, and it's about 1.8 right now. Getting it from high producing areas of the Mancos gas is a challenge for us that we see in the San Juan. But at the same time, we're working in areas and working with existing infrastructure companies, field service companies, midstream companies to move it out. So, to wrap up, any sort of thoughts for the future? Just hold under our hats before the midterms. A lot of us got projects going when gas and oil was, $2 and $30, and here we are now with the same projects. People are just dusting off some of their old prospects,
No, that's right, and that's what makes me, as I say, perversely optimistic, because I do think, even 6 months ago, before seeing some of the things that have now happened, I was thinking, gee, 4 years of bad policymaking from this administration could really take us back to a position that would be bad. Well, that's extrapolating the recent history. Now I look at it and I say, if the election goes the way I suspect it will, the promulgation of some of that bad policy is going to stop. The reversal of it, and maybe even some instigation of better policy, could be upon us, and it won't be a year from now. It might be as soon as 3 to 6 months after the election, and that would be a very favorable development. The sense of innovation is the big advantage we've had in energy, because technologically there are things that can be done. So there's a lot of things that can happen as long as we have an attitude that really begins to think in more depth about what is a balanced solution to the challenges. If we don't, and we just try to focus with an apocalyptic view of what people think is going to happen, then it could turn out differently. But I think there's enough in-depth knowledge going on. There's a fellow named Andrew Lees in the UK who is brilliant in his assessment of what's the role of renewables, what's the level of renewables we can get to, and still be effective. And it's not 100% renewables. Those who think, well, 100% would be what we need to do in order to save the planet, I would argue with that. I would say we need to decarbonize in a significant way, but the idea of 100% suggests you do not understand intermittency. Intermittency says you will have an unreliable grid if you believe you can go to 100% wind and solar, and you somehow have not solved the problem of how do you store energy that you can use when the sun's not shining, when the wind's not blowing. And today we don't have the answer to that. Over time we may get there, but it's not going to be just Elon Musk's batteries. And it's not going to just be batteries coming from China, because they've managed to line up all the resources. And by the way, the environmentalists who so far have kind of looked the other way on what it takes to mine the rare earths that need to be there for those batteries are going to be waking up to that impact as well. And they're going to also realize fueling the kind of vehicles that can move that kind of earth to get you those kind of rare earths. We need to do it a lot more effectively than we're doing today if they want to have a balanced environmental impact from renewables. So those are just a few stray thoughts that we can talk about another time.
Okay, well, we appreciate your time here, and always a pleasure to speak with you and hear your perspective. It's I hear a lot of things, but I don't get to go down some of the nooks and crannies that you get to take us. So it's very incredible, especially some of the new innovations coming up. And I think oil and gas could be around for a long time. We're gonna need them. We're gonna need them domestically more than anything, and that's, I think, the message I want fellow producers and people that listen in on this webinar to understand. And in August Energy IQ is going to be Robert Bryce, journalist, author, host of the Power Hungry podcast, which I listen to often. He's cutting edge energy writer, like Tom said. I think that's interesting. He testified before the Senate, thought he was talking to a wall. he is so amazing that his perspective. And he once described himself as a liberal who was mugged by thermodynamics. So he's very articulate as far as how the energy world goes. So, and Tom, thanks, huge thank you to you. Great commentary, perspective. We could speak a lot longer about this. So kudos for coming on. And all of you, thanks for letting me share this episode of the Energy IQ with you. Most important discussions on United States energy, and we're really coming at it from an investment banker, Tom Petrie, and a very small independent producer, my company, San Juan Resource. So wanted to also recognize PESCO. They're one of our sponsors. For over 50 years, Process Equipment and Service Company, or PESCO, has been proudly designing, building, and maintaining production equipment for its customers. Located in Farmington, New Mexico, PESCO sells and services units from across the western United States, from large majors to small independents like San Juan Resources. PESCO is proud to sponsor the Energy IQ, and they look forward to working with you, supporting the San Juan Basin community in any way they can.